Welcome to the Fergus Falls Business Spotlight podcast, the show that takes a deep dive into local businesses and the individuals that run our community. To guide you along the way, here's your host, Jacob Bittner.
Oh, welcome, listeners. Welcome into another episode. This is an exciting one because we're here in a new location. I've been hinting some news and some news for the future of the podcast for a while, and I finally get to bring that news to the people today, and I'm very excited. So, the podcast is partnering with Leighton Media, and I'm really, really excited about that opportunity. We're up here at the radio station today. I've got Chris Schelke back on the microphone for his reappearance on the podcast, his second appearance. How are you doing today?
Jacob, I'm doing fine. Thank you.
You know, I couldn't think of a better guest to get up here and kick off the new era of the podcast than having you back on the show.
I've been making trips up to the radio station over the years, so it was just like I could second nature.
You're here.
Boom. I'm here for you.
You're here for the people. The people need your knowledge.
Here for the people.
You're here for the people. As far as the show goes, guys, I would like to say not a lot's going to change, but the stuff that does change in the show, I think, is going to be a big improvement. I mean, we're looking at partnering here with a very, very well-established media company that has tons of resources.
So, Jacob, does this mean I have to behave myself?
It might mean I have to behave myself, Chris. No.
All right. What kind of language are we prohibited from using?
Well,
is this like now we have to follow, what is it, FCC rules?
I think there's some of that. There's some of that goes on. It sounds like we're still working out the details as to what the airtime for the podcast will look like on the radio. I believe 1250 KBRF is going to be where that lands locally here. So I'm excited for that opportunity. Right. But yeah, it does mean there's going to be some rules to follow, but it all sounds like it's those general, like, no swearing, none of this, none of that. I don't think that they're
George Carlin's 7 dirty words.
I don't think they're like trying to censor my mind, but we'll see how that goes. I mean, it could be a slippery slope. I mean, at the end of the day though, you know, we are partnered here with a really, really big company, and there is going to be a certain level of representation that goes along with that. But I also want to keep it real, and I'm not to talk about whatever I want to talk about on this show. So,
including today, right?
We'll push the limits. However, we need to push the limits still. So
it's good.
But, I do have to thank the sponsors that have been with the show for a long time. Stumbinos. We're not drinking coffee this afternoon, but I'm going to see to it that we get some Stumbinos going in this building. I'm not sure what kind of coffee they're serving here, but if I'm going to be here every morning, I'm going to need some Stumbinos coffee up in this place. So it will be Stumbinos. Shout out Lakes Area Grow Co., all that you've done for the show as well, and Victor Lundeen's. I'm looking forward to expanding on the advertising mediums and getting creative with some of the different ways that we're getting some other businesses in the community involved in the show as well. So if you're interested in that, ffbspodcast@gmail.com is a great way to get a hold of me if you have any questions. So, all right, let's talk about this. We are doing a deep dive into the RTC, into the state hospital here in Fergus that is now closed. This is a deep history. I don't know how deep into this topic you've gone into every aspect, every crevice of it, I assume.
Yeah. I mean, so we are on the heels of our tour of the state hospital. This will come out after that. But we, every time we typically do 1 to 2 tours of the state hospital, exterior tours, because we're not allowed inside. The inside tours of the state hospital that the Friends of the Kirkbride used to do have been discontinued. I can't even venture. I think it's maybe about 10 years or so.
Why?
Yeah. So, right now the air quality is deemed not good or safe to have the public venturing for any extended period of time inside. We can talk about that.
Asbestos.
I don't know if it's asbestos. I think they're talking about more potential mold and, that kind of thing. But we can address that, I believe, later, because I have concerns about that. But people, I just want to tell you that we do a cemetery tour in the fall, the Fergus Falls State Hospital Cemetery and Poor Farm. But there is just endless interest and fascination with this facility, the Fergus Falls State Hospital, not only because of its immensity, its enormity as just a building. You go around the building now. You can go to the back, and with the removal of the auditorium, the 1960 auditorium, and then the powerhouse, and some of those outside buildings, which we wasn't real effort to save them. It's a compromise that they were taken out, but actually it gives you a view of the Kirkbride-inspired architecture, the U-shaped continuous building. It's just really, I had a group of kids from Alexandria High School the other day, and their jaws just drop at how big this place is. And so people want, so there's the immensity of the building, but people are also want to hear about the treatments and what was it like to be up there. Are there ghosts there? Are there dead people? So forth. I didn't
even put paranormal activity on my sheet, but we're adding it. Paranormal activity. Yeah. We're adding it.
Well, you can add that. I'm maybe not the person to get into that, but the point is that there is just unbelievable, insatiable interest in this place, Jacob. And so what we try to do with our tour is give the good that happened at the state hospital, because a lot of good went on, a lot of bad things went on up there. So what is it? What is the question? What is the state hospital? And it's really just a combination of those good and bad.
Right.
So, and that gets into the whole history of mental health treatments and so forth, institutionalization. But let me just tell you, so a number of years ago, I talked to a volunteer who, as a kid, she grew up in Fergus Falls and took class trips up to the state hospital and did was in plays and there was very much part of the community up there. And she said that the Fergus Falls State Hospital, I asked her, why was it such a legendary, why did it have such an impact on people in Fergus Falls? And she said, it's a castle of questions, our very own Wizard of Oz. And to me, that it's a larger than life complex, and it's a complicated history. And what we try to do is just be as honest as possible about that history. If people don't like it, too bad. It is the reality of the situation. This is what happened. And if we don't hear about and learn about the good and the bad, then we just, I'm not one to ignore history. We got to tell the story.
That's right.
And we got to be honest about it.
That's right. Well, I'm excited to get into this conversation. I think we're going to unpack a lot of good stuff here.
Yes, sir.
We're going to get into those radical treatments. We're going to talk about some of that stuff. People told me I have to ask you about the tunnels. We're going to get into that. We're going to get into a bunch of stuff. But let's start before the hospital existed. Before Fergus had, I don't know what that land was before. I don't know what talk about that a little bit. If talk about the just setup in the mental health world at the time to bring the need for a regional hospital of that scale?
Okay, that's a good question. We'll start out with that. So, starting in the 19th century, early mid-19th century, there was a tremendous need for state-sponsored treatment of the mentally ill. So, in previous eras, people were often confined to prison-like settings where neglect and abuse were common. They were just, the mentally ill were ignored. There weren't really treatment options or diagnosis. People were deemed insane or crazy or lunatics. And so, and as more and more of these people were diagnosed, or not diagnosed, but just there were more and more of these people in society, what to do with them. So in the mid-19th century, a man named Thomas Kirkbride led an effort to seek more progressive methods of treatment. And he believed mentally ill patients should be treated as sick people, like any other illness. But he said it was brain sickness, and that they should be cured, or they can be cured. Okay.
Was that before or after he started draining their blood out of their brains?
Get out of here. No, he didn't do that.
Sorry, keep going about Kirkbride. Sorry.
So putting theory into practice, Thomas Kirkbride developed this moral management philosophy.
Okay.
A moral management philosophy that included architectural concepts. So Kirkbride inspired asylums across the country they were a central administration tower flanked by patient wings with setbacks to allow for maximum light and ventilation. So a lot of windows, a lot of light, because patients needed that to feel that they weren't just in some prison, dank, dark, dungeon-type setting. So, and patients in his philosophy were also encouraged to work, as that provided a sense of purpose and responsibility that helped, quote, regulate the mind as well as improve physical fitness. All right, there were 2 state hospitals in Minnesota prior to Fergus Falls. The first one was at St. Peter and then at Rochester. Both were overcrowded. They had poor ventilation. They were poorly managed, and it was not a good situation. So the state of Minnesota realized that they needed a 3rd state hospital. And so they had a legislative committee that was put together, and they toured the state in the summer of 1885 looking for potential sites. And there were a number of communities, including Fergus Falls, that were toured. Fergus wasn't the only one. So they came to Fergus Falls, and, basically, long story short, Fergus Falls was selected based on the criteria of there was a location just north of town where there was on a hill, kind of a hill, so there was good drainage. There was good from water. There wasn't that water would drain away from that ground, so it wasn't a swampy area. There was also a lot of room for expansion. So that was another criteria. It had to be in an area that had a transportation system. So Fergus Falls had a good, rail transportation. And so these, and an area that had a good, clean water source.
Gotcha. And this was mid-1800s?
This is talking 1885.
Okay. Late 1800s.
Yeah, so very practical considerations. And so when they considered these practical considerations, water supply, transportation, room for expansion, Fergus Falls really filled the bill, as they said, and in 1886, it was awarded the 3rd state hospital. So they hired a guy named Warren B. Donnell, who was a famous Minnesota architect. The state hired him, and he drew up plans based upon the concepts of Thomas Kirkbride. And construction began in 1888 with primarily brick from Pelican Rapids and Elizabeth brickyards. Okay, so they were brought in by rail. And so the westernmost part of the hospital was built, what they called West Detached, as a separate building, and that opened in July of 1890. So it was that separate building. Construction literally continued, for the next 15 years. So there was constant construction because the plan called for a complete building. So West Detached was first. East Detached then came up second. Then they filled in those corridors, and the center tower was the last actually to be completed. That was the administration area, doctor's apartments, superintendent apartments. And so what you see now as the continuous facility took about 15 years to build.
And correct me if I'm wrong. This could just be nonsense information I heard from somebody when preparing for this, but was it at one point the largest continuous square foot building in the United States until the Pentagon was built?
Well, I'm not sure. I can't dispute that, and I can't say yes. I don't know. I mean, all I know is that there is a ton. What is it? I think 500,000 square feet, at least. People can correct me, but it's at least 500,000 square feet, and so it is enormous. But they needed that. They utilized it all. And there were tunnels, yes, that were built to connect the entire campus. So all from one end to the other, they was connected. They built a nurses' cottage, which was to house nurses training, female nurses. There was a tunnel connected to the nurses' cottage, out to the receiving ward. So yes, there was a series of tunnels. They were primarily built so people didn't have to get out in the cold weather. And then, utilities were put in, but there were also, in the lower levels, there was, for heating, for laundry, for food service. They were, the basement level and the tunnels were well utilized for a variety of this, infrastructure of the facility.
So they would have been used similar to a way that they use the sky walkway system in Minneapolis now,
exactly.
Just like to connect buildings in the winter. And
yes, there was nothing sinister about the way
I'm
they
sure
were
there
built.
was some
People
sinister things down there.
Well, sure, it's a mental institution, but we people want to see. God, of course, they were just filled with crazy people, and they have this. Right, this mental picture of it just being this crazy place where people were running wild and weird surgeries were taking place and so forth and so on. But it was really a practical usage of space.
Yeah, and the rumors I heard as a kid were that it stretches beyond the campus, right? That's the popular rumor that we all want to believe.
All the way to the school.
We want to be able to go to the school and the police station and everywhere, right?
No, you could not. You could not. And unfortunately, some of the tunnels had suffered damage. So I believe most of them are inaccessible.
Completely condemned.
Yeah. And they are blocked off from.
Do you know how many miles, how many feet of tunnels there were? Do you know how expansive that system was?
Stretched. Well, like I said, it was the campus itself.
Yep.
So between the buildings. So
but everything was
underneath
connected.
Everything was connected. Yes.
And there are some tunnels that are able to go through still.
I don't. Yeah. I think the entrance may be blocked off, but I don't think they didn't fill in the tunnels. Some were destroyed because they weren't in very good shape. But as far as I know what the city did, you have to talk to the city engineer, that there are still some usable tunnels if they ever wanted to get back to that.
So you could potentially do a tour in the tunnels. There's some liabilities in there, but there would be a potential for the public to see the tunnels on a tour at some point.
I believe so.
Okay, well, we got to make that happen. That's the one that people want to see right there. The inside and the tunnels. That's what But all right, go back to a little bit more about that construction process, the Kirkbride building model and that property layout.
Right.
Because I've been up there before. Was that the first Kirkbride building layout format? That wasn't the first one. Okay.
In fact, it was one of the last. I mean, most of the Kirkbride inspired. Again, he was not an architect, but it was based on his principles. He had incorporated architectural concepts so he could have this moral management plan. So, like I said, this Warren B. Donnell was the actual architect, and he designed this facility based upon Kirkbride's principles of lots of light, lots of ventilation, 2 wings, with a tower, center tower, patient wings on each side. So patients could be segregated. They didn't want, the violent patients right next to the, people, less calmer patients. So I think that there was segregation going on. Initially, the men were separated from the women. what was the question here?
It was about the just the layout in general,
the layout,
the Kirkbride model,
Right.
and the layout of the property up there.
Right. So if you go to like Traverse City, Michigan, there's a Kirkbride facility up there. That's much older, and in fact, it was in far worse condition than our hospital. And they're starting to renovate that and to make it for small businesses, shops, restaurants, bars, and so forth and so on. So they're reusing it.
Gotcha.
But this is probably, as far as I know, one of the most complete Kirkbrides remaining in the United States. Certainly one of the most complete. That is, so it's very unique. There's very few Kirkbride inspired asylums left.
Wow.
In the United States. And we have one right here in Fergus Falls.
So, and part of that was also an introduction to like the patients in the working aspect of the facility, right? So they were incorporated into the operations as far as the farm goes.
All right, yeah,
and all of that.
Right, exactly. So his idea was really to have almost a self-contained community where patients they fed themselves, and so all the services.
I heard they even dug graves for themselves.
So there's so much to get into, Jacob.
We're going to get to the poor farm. There's
so much to get into. The fact is that there was a farm, and the first crop was harvested literally. They started farming almost immediately. Now it opened in late summer of 1890. So they couldn't do it until the next year, really get crop going. But they had, they grew vegetables, they grew oats, they grew wheat, they grew hay because they had a full-fledged dairy operation, 200 plus Holstein cows that provided 3,300 pounds of milk daily. There was a piggery, there was a slaughterhouse operation, so and then most of the work was done by patients. They hired some seasonal workers, paid, but most of the work was done by patients. And so imagine though. So eventually, you get more and more people being admitted. So by the turn of the century, you have 1,200, 1,500 patients there, along with hundreds of staff. And it's open 24/7. It didn't close. It didn't close on the weekends. It didn't close for Christmas. It didn't close for 4th of July. It was open. It had to be open.
It's where people lived.
It's where people live. Year round, 24/7, 365 days a year, 3 meals a day, So you had to have constant services. You had to do constantly laundry. You had to, people had to work in the laundry, and you had, medical services. People got sick up there. So you had a fully trained medical staff. And people wanted to think that, once you were admitted to the state hospital, you never left. You were there till you died. And that's not true at all. There were some patients that did spend a long time there, but their goal was to try to treat patients as best they could and move them out into society. That was an absolute goal. The methods of treatment were basically all the types of treatment in the field of mental health were tried at the Fergus Falls State Hospital.
Dang. Okay. So
when they started, the first year, the first superintendent, a guy named Alonzo Williamson, he was into homeopathic treatment. So he was. This is what he said. The entire theory and practice of this institution will be based on the fact that patients are not criminals for whom we have to care, but sick people, brain sick. There's the Kirkbride philosophy. Treatment will be directed not to restraint and punishment, but to cure. Milk is the main special diet in this hospital, and we prefer to give it hot. Next in importance is rest. Through the complementary forces of milk and rest, we will be able to dispense with every kind of physical restraint. That was the ideal. Okay? But apparently the first patients there were what they described as men of the milder and quieter type. But did that continue as more and more patients were admitted to the state hospital, often severely, had severe mental illness? And so, no, it did not. So they went from milk and rest, and then they eventually had hydrotherapy. Then they eventually tried insulin coma therapy. Then they tried all these other things.
That hydrotherapy, the insulin shock therapy is pretty crazy. I mean, all that stuff's really wild. I don't know if we want to touch more on let's talk about, we'll get into the treatments more, but I want to talk about like that early economic impact on Fergus.
So, yeah, I mean, you had to have patients didn't build the state hospital. It was workers. So they had to hire, a lot of workers to do this constant construction.
And we talked about in your episode, the first one, about the history of Fergus and how this kind of fit into Fergus history. Because Fergus was founded in what year?
Well, 1872.
72. So this was within 15 years of founding Fergus Falls.
And the community worked really hard to get the state hospital. They made the pitch because they knew, even though asylums had kind of a negative connotation, generally, they knew it would benefit the local economy. It provided jobs. They often needed services. They needed to buy, anything from saws and hammers to, materials from within the community. It used water, that was supplied by, Fergus Falls. So yes, it was state run, but so the state had more. It was never a privately run institution, but they required services from the local community. And as the years went on, they became better paying jobs, especially after World War II. They became better paying jobs. They had jobs of attendance, jobs with benefits, union, retirement. And so people had them that worked at the state hospital. Hundreds of people worked there. If they were earning a good wage, what did they do with their money? Well, they bought houses in the community. They went to restaurants. They bought furniture. They bought clothing. This was really the kind of the golden age of the community, where there was a thriving middle class with many of these people working at the state hospital, and then they spent money in the community. So yes, the economic impact was tremendous.
And that probably allowed Fergus to be on the radar for more things when it came up down the road, like the legislative building we have in town.
Right. Right.
All that stuff. It paved the way for everything.
Absolutely.
The interstate, all of it.
Absolutely. So when, the state was closing down state hospitals, as early as the 1970s, Fergus Falls hung on to that facility for its dear life for years and years and years, trying, new things, from alcohol treatment, to, various programs just to keep it open. And it did. I think, we were one of the last state hospitals to finally close in 2007, I believe.
Let's get back to life in the hospital, what it was like for patients there. You mentioned, obviously, they had their goal early on, which was never to fall into those inhumane methods. They wanted to be able to rehab people with warm milk and not ice pick lobotomies. But you go down the path you go down eventually, right?
Well, right. So, I mean, it's very complicated, and not that we can touch on everything in the little bit of time we have today.
We got unlimited time today, Chris.
But the fact is that It really depended on funding from the state. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, and then, of course, World War II in the 1940s, that was a tough time at the state hospital because so many of the resources were taken away, were used elsewhere, whatever resources were available. So, for instance, during the Depression, the economy was tanking, severely during the 1930s. And that's when the patient population skyrocketed in the 1930s, typically 1,900, even 2,000 patients at one time, but the state didn't have the resources to put back into the hospital. So they, in some respects, were really kind of left on their own. And, Superintendent Patterson complained about that all the time. And then, of course, with World War II, all the nation's resources were going to the war effort, and state hospitals were often an afterthought. And so, and they had less attendance. There were so many available men were in the service, and, there just weren't as many attendants to care for the patient population. And so, sometimes neglect, escapes happened. Patients were sometimes neglected. There were incidences of abuse. Were they widespread here? I don't think so. They were isolated. But across the country, there were definitely systemic instances of abuse and neglect. And so it really came to an head during World War II when a couple of Quaker men, they were conscientious objectors, so they did not go to war. So the government said, if you're not going to fight, then you're going to go to work in asylums. And they did. But a number of these Quaker men were so appalled by what they saw in a number of, especially urban asylums, that they kind of blew the whistle on the whole institution. And in 1946, there was an article in Life magazine called Bedlam 1946, which it really exposed readers to these horrible practices, complete with photographs of even naked patients and neglect and abuse and isolation. And so what kind of resulted from this overwhelming surge of patients, what did they do? They needed to come up with some kind of practices to alleviate the population of insane people. And so unfortunately, one of the results of this was different types of treatment, including psychosurgery.
Crazy stuff. So I'm not sure what of these actually went down in Fergus here, but some of the more extreme measures mankind have used throughout the years. Obviously, in the earlier years, there was like exorcism and religious rituals that got pretty aggressive with restraints and stuff. I think that straitjackets and chains and shackles and those kind of restraints probably were used.
There were straitjackets
for sure.
used. Sure.
I think the straitjacket is less popular now. I don't think they use that as much anymore. In rare cases, maybe. And then obviously the confinement in the asylums and the prison-like aspect of life is something where it gets really intense. Is the hydrotherapy? It's immersion in cold water or high pressure jets, sometimes leading to hypothermia or drowning amongst patients.
Well, the theory back when it was started in the early 20th century was patients were to be not submerged, but placed in tubs at blood temperature. So what's blood
98 degrees, right?
So not cold water, but blood temperature water. And then that was to calm patients, okay? And it generally, they said, was worked until, of course, an accident took place in Fergus Falls where a patient who was agitated was placed in a tub. And then when the nurse, the attendant, turned on the hot and cold water faucets, they said she thrashed about so violently that actually placed a cover was attached over the tub with just her head exposed so she could not get out. And then because there weren't very many attendants on staff at that point, in 1914, she was basically then left in her room in the tub. And then when they looked in on her hours later, the nurse said she did not look right. She was just laying there. And when they lifted her out of the tub, just huge chunks of her skin fell off. And she died 5 days later, this patient, because she was scalded to death because the cold water faucet malfunctioned, letting only hot water into the tub. So, it was reported. They had to have an inquiry with the state, and the superintendent said that it was an unfortunate accident, but that sometimes takes place at asylums. So there were only 120 attendants at that time for a patient population of 1,500.
Wow. Well,
there you go.
Yeah.
No, was it intentional, Jacob? But it was not intentional.
Of course
man.
not. Of course not.
It was an accident. It was an unfortunate accident.
But it was certainly an oversight and neglect.
Absolutely.
I mean,
absolutely.
And yeah. All right. I got to keep going through this list now. We just got dark, but I would like to say we're going to lighten things, but we might have some more dark stories here. Insulin shock therapy. It's basically the practice of inducing seizures in patients by administering large doses of insulin, often resulting in severe side effects, including coma and death. That went down there as well.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know much about the insulin coma theory, but I do know that shock treatments were obviously a very regular part of patients' treatments.
Electrotherapy, yep.
And I can't hear it. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, did you get cut out? Can you hear yourself?
No, I can hear me now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
So shock treatments that was a huge part. And in the early days, apparently they didn't have muscle relaxants. They didn't put patients out. They just put a thing on your temples, turned on the machine, the shock treatment, and you had to have attendants basically holding you down. We had a volunteer nurse. She was a retired nurse, and she said when she went through her psych rotation that they had to help with shock treatments, and people would regularly break bones or dislocate their back or something because they would just turn on the machine and the convulsions were so severe. They got much more refined and better at it, just little bits of shock at a time. And then they would use drugs to put patients out. And I believe in some instances, it's still used today as a form of treatment. So the early shock treatments must have been horrible, but it got a little bit better. It got better as time went on.
What about lobotomies? Lobotomy is the surgical procedure involving severing connections to and from the prefrontal cortex of the brain, resulting in significant personality changes and cognitive impairments.
What about lobotomies?
Did we do
Jacob?
Did they perform lobotomies at the state hospital?
They did. For a number of years, people denied.
What about lobotomies?
People denied that they took place. But after my first tour in 2009 or something, I was just about ready to start my stories from the state hospital tour, and there was an older gentleman there that I knew and from township stuff, and he kind of wistfully said, I haven't been up here since 1950. And then he went on to explain that as a high school junior, they went up to the state hospital Fergus Falls High School juniors. So we're talking 16, 17-year-old kids. And they showed them, it was kind of a field day. So they showed them different tests that were done, and they had a tour of the hospital. And then he said they took these kids into a room where a patient was in a gurney, propped up in a gurney, and then a man in a lab coat proceeded to drill a hole in the side of this patient's temple. And then he drilled a hole on the other side of the temple, inserted this kind of retractable wire loop, pulled it, and that was it. And what this did was sever the frontal lobe nerve fibers. And what they had just witnessed, these high school juniors, and it was verified by another member of that class, was the Freeman-Watts prefrontal lobotomy. Now, Walter Freeman was a physician, a doctor, and he streamlined the process and toured the country even further with the transorbital lobotomy. And this method involved lifting the upper eyelid and placing the point of a thin surgical instrument under the eyelid and against the top of the eye socket. It was then driven through a thin layer of bone and into the brain and swept from side to side to again sever the frontal lobe nerve fibers. Whoa. So by early 50s, at least 19,000 Americans had been lobotomized. But after the introduction of talk about crazy, right? After the introduction of the antipsychotic drug Thorazine, lobotomies were soon discontinued. And yes, they took place at the Fergus Falls State Hospital.
Wow.
Okay. But, obviously a barbaric practice perpetrated by mainstream medicine.
Yeah. Whoa. The last one here, as far as the barbaric treatments, is trepantation. I don't know anything about that. Trepantation.
I don't know nothing about
trepantation. Is drilling holes in the skull to release evil spirits or relieve pressure believed to cause mental illness.
I don't know. We're not going to get into evil spirits, man.
But yeah, I'm sure when it comes to some of these treatments here, when it comes to like the spirits and the religious practices, those probably existed more in like the Middle Ages of humanity rather than like this was like the first wave of like really trying to make this a legitimate thing. And we realize how wrong we got it. I think that is one of the things that caused the decline. We'll get into the decline of the facility and all of that. But yeah, I do want to touch on the poor farm though, and the graveyards.
Okay. So people died at the state hospital.
Oh yes.
They died.
Yeah. Not everybody lives through lobotomies.
Well, it was this, no, we're talking before the lobotomies.
Right.
The average annual, so for instance, I figured from 1915 to 1917, before the flu pandemic, the average annual death rate was about 54 annually. 54 people. 54 people a year.
Okay. From the hospital.
Yep. And then during the 1918 pandemic, it more than doubled. And at its peak, influenza claimed 54 lives alone in October 1918. Now, a number of these patients were buried at the cemetery. So there's a cemetery north of the state hospital. About 3,200 patients are buried there. The first one, literally, within a month after the hospital opened, a guy named John Olson, he's buried there from 1890. And I think the last burial was, oh my gosh, in the 1960s, I believe, early 1960s. And they were not, these are patients that had nowhere else to go. If they died, no family was claimed because the hospital made an attempt to try to contact family or contact their home area. Someone would come and bury them in their hometown. But obviously that didn't always take place. And so they were buried and there was not a headstone, but just a wrought iron marker that was driven into the ground with a number on it. That's it. No name, no date, just a number. So there was a map that was kept, and we have a copy of that map, the Historical Society does, with the names of patients. And there has been an effort from a group to mark where they're at, at least with the little in-ground markers with the names and the date of the people buried there. And it's really kind of sad because a lot of these patients are immigrants or children of immigrants from, Norway, Sweden, Finland, so forth. And there's just, there's so very little information about them. We do know, that they had, it was tough. I mean, you're leaving a foreign country. So you're a Norwegian, and I don't know where your ancestors came from, but you're leaving your home because life is tough, and you're coming to America because the images, you're going to make it in America. You're gonna be successful here. You're gonna make a life for yourself. But for those first generation of immigrants, it was hard. There was grinding work and isolation, and often a high mortality rate, and sometimes some people just couldn't handle it, and so they just broke. And a lot of them came to institutions like the Fergus Falls State Hospital, and if they didn't have any family, any friends, they were alone, isolated, they were buried at the state hospital cemetery. And we're getting more. There's a lot of people are coming back and trying to find out about their ancestors that were buried at the hospital.
So the rumors, and we got into this a little bit. I did attend the Poor Farm tour last summer, cemetery tour. I would highly recommend being a part of that. It was windy that day it was windy and chilly last summer for that tour.
So there's two cemeteries, Jacob. We have the State Hospital Cemetery, and then you walk over to the Poor Farm Cemetery, and that was actually built first. That was placed. The Poor Farm Cemetery was there before the State Hospital Cemetery.
It was marked, or that's where they started burying people first?
That's where they buried people. They weren't necessarily patients at the State Hospital. They were, again, indigenous people, or there might be some people who were victims of crime or criminals themselves. We just don't know. They had nowhere to go, so they placed them at that cemetery.
Obviously, you think of that, and my first thought was like mass burial, like dig a big pit and throw a bunch of bodies into it. But like that's not how it went down. It wasn't like that. It wasn't like you had the patients dig a big hole so they could throw a bunch of bodies into the hole. It wasn't like that. Okay, all right.
No. So, but the thing is, at the state hospital, there was a complaint among the superintendents that people were, dying, and so they tried for 24 years to get a morgue built at the state hospital, and the state kept denying them money for a morgue, a proper morgue. So the dead patients, were placed in a basement under one of the patient wards.
That's
before they're transported out to the
now we're getting
cemetery.
into the paranormal activity, Chris.
Well, I mean, they were then eventually
because this is the same place people were living, right? This is like underneath the living quarters, underneath the hospital operation quarters.
Yes.
We've got dead bodies down there.
Yes.
So they were dying there. They never left there. They were buried there. They're there. They're there, dude.
No, they are not buried there. But they had to be prepared there and then placed out at the cemetery.
Right. But but I mean, let's pause. We can get back to the graveyards because it's just the two go so well hand in hand.
Well,
the death and the paranormal activity. Tell me what you think you should tell me.
Well, I'll tell you what. This is what Dr. First Alonzo Williamson and then George Welsh. This is what George Welsh wrote. Since the opening of the hospital, he was the superintendent. Since the opening of the hospital, we have been using a basement under one of the wards for the purpose of a morgue. This, besides being entirely inadequate for the purpose, is located immediately underneath a large room occupied by patients, neither a healthful nor cheerful arrangement.
You've just heard a condensed version of the Fergus Falls Business Spotlight podcast. For the entirety of the episode and more inspiring stories from our community, check out the Fergus Falls Business Spotlight podcast on Spotify, Audible, or wherever you get your podcasts.